Rome did not begin as marble. It began as a nervous landscape, a city of doorways that had to be guarded, hearth fires that had to be kept alive, graves that were not entirely quiet, fields watched by forces no human eye could see. Before the triumphal arches, before the emperors, before Jupiter sat above the city with a thunderbolt in his hand, Rome was surrounded by presences. Not stories, exactly. Not yet. Something older. Something closer to fear. To enter Rome's mythology, we have to step away from the polished statues and look beneath them. Not down into ruins, but into habits. The prayer before a journey. The offering at a threshold. The careful reading of a bird's flight. The uneasy respect given to the dead. This was a world where religion was not a private belief tucked safely inside the mind. It lived in gestures, laws, family rooms, military camps, and state ceremonies. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Because Roman mythology was never only a collection of tales about gods behaving badly on distant mountains. It was a system for surviving uncertainty, a language for power, a memory machine, a way of asking whether the city was still in agreement with the forces that protected it, or whether, somewhere unseen, that agreement had already begun to break. Chapter 2. Before Jupiter had a face. Before Jupiter had a face, Rome had a feeling. Not a vague feeling in the modern sense, not an emotion drifting through the air, but the sense that the world was crowded with powers. A doorway was not only a gap in a wall. A boundary stone was not only a marker between one plot of land and another. A spring was not only water rising from the ground. Fire was not only heat. Each of these things could carry a force, a presence, a pressure that had to be respected. This is one of the hardest parts of early Roman religion for us to imagine, because we usually expect mythology to arrive wearing a human shape. We look for a god with a name, a family tree, a scandal, a favorite weapon, a dramatic weakness. We expect thunder to become Jupiter, the sea to become Neptune, love to become Venus. But the older Roman imagination did not always begin with personalities. It began with power. The Latin word often used for this kind of sacred force is numen. It can be translated imperfectly as divine will, divine presence, or a kind of active spiritual authority. None of those translations quite catches the strangeness of it. A numen was not necessarily a god in the later storybook sense. It was more like the hidden charge inside a place, an action, a natural force, or a moment when ordinary life seemed to open onto something larger. And because that power was everywhere, early Roman religion was not something you visited only on festival days. It was folded into the practical business of being alive. You wanted the field to produce grain. You wanted the child to survive infancy. You wanted the door to protect the house rather than invite danger in. You wanted the dead to remain honored, not restless. You wanted the fire to keep burning, because fire was warmth, food, continuity, and the visible heart of a household. In a fragile agricultural world, where disease, weather, famine, and war could undo a family with little warning, religion was not decoration. It was management. That may sound cold, but it was not empty. It simply belonged to a culture that often treated the sacred as a relationship of duty. The gods, spirits, and forces of the world were not always approached through personal confession or emotional surrender. They were approached through correct action. A prayer had a shape, a sacrifice had a sequence, a vow created an obligation. A mistake in wording could matter, because ritual was a kind of contract, and contracts are not strengthened by improvising halfway through. This is where Rome begins to look different from the more familiar Greek world of myth. Greek stories often give us gods who argue, seduce, punish, disguise themselves, and reveal their personalities in vivid scenes. Rome certainly came to embrace those stories later, especially under Greek influence. But early Roman sacred life seems to have been more concerned with function than drama. What does this force do? Where does it operate? What does it require from us? How do we avoid offending it? A modern viewer might find that less colorful, but it may actually be more revealing, because a culture's deepest fears are often hidden in its routines. Consider the threshold. To us, a door is mostly architecture. To an early Roman household, it could be a vulnerable line between inside and outside, family and stranger, safety and exposure. The act of crossing mattered. Beginnings mattered. Openings mattered. Boundaries mattered. A world like this does not need a monster at every gate to feel haunted. The gate itself is enough. Or think of the field. Farming is never just farming when survival depends on forces you cannot command. Rain may come or fail. Seed may take root or rot. Animals may sicken. Borders may be disputed. A neighbor may move a stone. The land, then, is not neutral property. It is alive with obligations. You do not simply use it. You negotiate with it, mark it, bless it, and fear the consequences of mishandling it. This helps explain why early Roman religion could seem almost crowded with small divine responsibilities. Later writers preserve names and categories for powers connected with sowing, growth, storage, childbirth, doorways, boundaries, and countless other parts of life. Some of these may reflect very old practices. Some may have been organized, interpreted, or even exaggerated by later Romans trying to describe their own past. The evidence is not always clean, but the pattern is meaningful. Rome imagined the sacred not only above the world, but inside the tiny operations that kept the world from falling apart. That detail changes the entire mood of Roman mythology. It means Rome's earliest sacred imagination was not built first around entertainment, or even around explanation in the way we might expect. It was built around attention. Pay attention to the sign. Pay attention to the wording. Pay attention to the boundary. Pay attention to the dead. Pay attention to the fire. The divine was not necessarily distant. It was nearby, precise and easily mishandled. There is a quiet severity in that. Early Rome did not seem to want gods who merely inspired wonder. It wanted powers that could be approached, persuaded, contained, and made part of social order. Even awe had to be disciplined. And this is where the central mystery begins to sharpen. Roman mythology, in its oldest layers, was not just a museum of charming tales. It was a technology of control. Control over fear, control over uncertainty, control over the dangerous gap between human plans and everything humans could not control. A farmer could not command the weather, but he could perform the rite. A family could not defeat death, but it could honor the ancestral dead. A city could not see the future, but it could watch the birds, inspect the sacrifice, and ask whether the gods approved. The modern instinct is to separate belief from politics, home from temple, myth from administration. Rome did not make those separations so neatly. The same habit of mind that treated a household threshold as sacred could later treat the borders of the state as sacred. The same concern for correct ritual could shape public ceremonies. The same fear of broken relations with unseen powers could become a language for explaining military defeat, plague, or political crisis. In other words, before Rome had grand mythology, it had sacred procedure. That may not sound romantic, but it is powerful. Stories can inspire a people, but procedures can organize them. A mythic tale might tell you where you came from. A ritual system tells you what to do at sunrise, at planting, at burial, at war, at the moment a child enters the family, at the moment a magistrate takes office. It gives the invisible world a timetable, and perhaps that is why Rome's gods, even after they acquired Greek faces and dramatic biographies, never fully lost their older character. Behind Jupiter, the thunderer, behind Mars, the warrior, behind Venus, the mother of Rome's destiny, there remained something more ancient and less theatrical: the pressure of sacred order itself. To understand Rome, then, we should not begin by looking upward to Olympus. We should begin lower, at the hearth, at the gate, at the line between two fields, at the riverbank where water moves with a will of its own, at the grave where the family still speaks to those who have gone ahead. There, before the gods became characters, before poets gave them speeches, before empire dressed them in marble, Rome learned its first mythological lesson. The world was full of powers, and survival belonged to those who knew how to answer them. Chapter 3. The House as a Hidden Temple. The first temple most Romans ever entered was not raised on a hill. It had no towering columns, no crowd of magistrates, no priest in public costume announcing the favor of the gods before an anxious city. It smelled of cooking smoke, stored grain, wool, oil, and the daily fatigue of human life. Children crossed through it before they understood what a god was. The elderly sat inside it with memories that were almost a second furniture. Slaves, relatives, guests, and clients moved through its rooms, each carrying their own place in the household order. This was the Roman home, and to call it simply private would be misleading. A Roman house was a shelter, yes. It was also an archive of blood, obligation, inheritance, rank, worship, and memory. Its walls held more than the living. In the Roman imagination, the family did not end neatly at death, and the gods did not remain politely outside the door. The home was a small sacred territory, watched over by powers whose names were ordinary enough to be spoken often, but old enough to feel rooted in something deeper than literature. The Lares guarded the household and its place in the world. The Penates watched over the stores, the provisions, the hidden continuity of bread, oil, wine, and survival. The Manes were the honored dead, ancestors who had crossed beyond life, but still belonged to the moral atmosphere of the family. The genius, especially of the male head of the household, represented a generative force, the living spirit of continuity that tied one generation to the next. Vesta was present in the fire, in the hearth, in that fragile flame without which a home became only a structure. Janus watched beginnings, entrances, and passages, the strange holiness of crossing from one state into another. These were not decorative ideas. They gave the home a map. A doorway was not merely where you entered. It was a controlled breach. A hearth was not merely where food was prepared. It was a center. A storeroom was not merely practical. It carried the anxiety of famine and the hope of tomorrow. A family shrine, whether simple or elaborate, gathered these meanings into one visible place. Later, Roman houses, especially those preserved in places like Pompeii and Herculaneum, give us vivid evidence of domestic shrines. But we should be careful here. The surviving examples do not show every Roman home in every century. Wealth, region, fashion, and period all mattered. Still, the pattern is too important to miss. Roman religion lived at household scale. This is where Roman mythology becomes intimate. Modern people often imagine myth as something told around a fire. Rome often treated myth as something maintained by the fire itself. The sacred did not need to arrive in a dramatic episode. It could appear in a daily offering, in a garland placed near household gods, in a prayer before a meal, in a father's duty to preserve the rituals handed down by those before him. The story was not always spoken as a story. Sometimes it was repeated as behavior. That may be the key to understanding why the Roman home feels so different from a modern private interior. Today, we often think of home as the place where public identity relaxes. In Rome, the home could be the place where public identity was manufactured. Family status, ancestry, marriage alliances, inheritance, and religious duty all met there. Even the ancestors in elite households could be displayed and remembered as evidence that the family had weight in the world. The dead were not simply mourned, they were positioned. That sounds harsh, but it reveals something precise. Roman memory was active. The past had work to do. Ancestors could inspire, authorize, warn, and burden the living. To belong to a family was to inherit not only property or a name, but obligations toward the dead and expectations for the future. The mains were not background atmosphere. They made the family longer than one lifetime. And this changes the way we should hear later Roman claims about destiny. When powerful Romans spoke of divine ancestry, when families traced themselves toward Venus, Mars, Hercules, or some heroic origin, they were not inventing ambition out of nothing. They were enlarging a pattern that already existed inside the household. The family shrine taught Rome how to think mythologically about lineage. The empire did not create that instinct. It inherited it from the room where the ancestors were remembered. There is also something quietly political about the Penates. At first glance, household gods of the storeroom may seem modest, almost humble. They do not thunder. They do not launch wars. They do not abduct maidens or overturn kingdoms. They protect provisions, and yet provisions are the difference between order and panic. A city can survive bad poetry more easily than an empty granary. The Penates remind us that early sacred life was often concerned with the material facts that keep people alive. Food storage may not sound mythic, but hunger has always been one of history's most persuasive theologians. Vesta, too, carries more weight than her gentleness suggests. Fire is domestic, but it is never only domestic. It transforms raw into cooked, cold into warmth, darkness into visibility. It gathers the household. It threatens the household. It must be tended. It can die. In that sense, the hearth was both comfort and warning. A neglected flame is a small image of collapse. Later, Rome would make Vesta central to the life of the state through the Vestal Virgins and the public sacred fire. But the logic begins closer to the ground. A community, like a family, survives by keeping its central fire alive. Janus belongs near the door, but he also belongs near every uncertainty. He is one of the most Roman of divine figures, not because he gives us a rich, dramatic biography, but because he understands transition, coming and going, beginning and ending, war and peace, one year opening into another. A door is simple until you consider what it means to pass through one. To cross a threshold is to leave one order and enter another. Roman religion paid attention to that moment because Roman culture cared deeply about boundaries between household and street, citizen and foreigner, living and dead, sacred and profane, permitted and forbidden. A culture reveals itself by what it marks. Rome marked thresholds. Inside the house, these sacred presences formed a miniature cosmos, not a universe of distant stars, but of relationships. The living stood in the middle. Behind them were the dead. Around them were protective forces. Beneath their routines was fear. Ahead of them was continuity, fragile and demanding. The home was where a Roman first learned that existence was negotiated through duty. This is why the household matters so much to the larger story. If we leap too quickly to Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and the imperial cult, we miss the first grammar of Roman sacred life. The city did not learn religion only from temples. It learned it from fathers making offerings, mothers tending domestic order, children watching gestures before they knew their meaning, and families treating memory as something almost alive. The house was not separate from mythology. It was mythology in its most concentrated form. Before Rome imagined itself as the chosen ruler of nations, it imagined the family as a guarded island in a dangerous world. Before the state negotiated with the gods, the household did. Before the empire claimed divine ancestry, ordinary rooms had already made space for ancestors, spirits, fire, food, birth, death, and passage. And perhaps that is why Roman mythology could become so durable. It was not only painted on temple walls or carved into public monuments. It had already entered the smallest habits of living. It sat beside the meal. It waited near the door. It watched from the shrine. The gods beneath the city were also beneath the roof. Chapter 4. The Wolf, the River, and the Blood of Mars. Every city wants an origin it can bear to repeat. Rome chose one with teeth. According to later tradition, the story begins before the city itself, in the older landscape of Alba Longa, with a royal family divided by ambition and fear. A usurping king seizes power. A young woman, Rhea Silvia, is forced into a sacred role that should prevent her from having children. Then, in the charged language of myth, Mars enters the story. The god of war becomes the father of twins. Romulus and Remus are born into danger before they can even cry their own names. Their existence is a threat because birth, in royal myth, is never simply birth. It is a political event. A child can be a future. Two children can be a rebellion. So the infants are ordered to be removed, exposed, erased, before they can become a claim. They are placed by the river, left to the mercy of water, weather, animals, and chance. The river is the Tiber, and in Rome's imagination, it is never just scenery. It is boundary, witness, carrier of fate. Water can destroy, but it can also deliver. In the story, the twins do not vanish. The river lowers, or the basket comes to rest, or the dangerous current becomes strangely gentle. The details shift in the surviving tradition, as myths often do, but the meaning is steady. Rome's founders pass through abandonment and do not die. Then comes the most famous image. A she-wolf finds them. It is so familiar now that it can almost feel decorative, stamped onto the memory of Rome like a symbol on a coin. But pause with it for a moment. Two human infants beneath an animal's body, receiving milk from the wilderness. Civilization, in this story, is not born safely inside a palace. It is fed by the wild. The future city enters life not through law, but through exposure, not through comfort, but through survival. Later rationalizing explanations tried to soften the image. Some ancient writers noted that the Latin word lupa could also carry another meaning, referring to a prostitute, and suggested that perhaps the wolf was really a woman of low status who rescued and nursed the twins. That possibility tells us something interesting, not because it solves the myth neatly, but because it shows the discomfort surrounding it. Rome inherited an image too powerful to discard and too strange to explain completely. A wolf mother is not respectable in the ordinary civic sense, but she is unforgettable, and that may be the point. Rome's foundation myth does not present greatness as pure, polished, or innocent. It gives the city an origin in violated order, contested bloodlines, divine violence, exposure, animal rescue, and revenge. By the time Romulus and Remus grow into young men, the story has already taught its listener that power emerges from danger. It is not discovered in a clean place. It is dragged out of the marsh. The twins eventually learn who they are. They overthrow the usurper, restore the old royal line, and then turn toward a new ambition, the founding of their own city. Here the myth narrows from heroic restoration to something more uncomfortable. Two brothers have survived together. Two brothers have shared abandonment, rescue, and identity. Yet the future cannot belong to both. This is where the story becomes deeply Roman. The dispute over the city's location and leadership is usually framed through omens. Romulus chooses the Palatine Hill. Remus is associated with the Aventine. They watch the sky for birds, seeking divine approval. In one version, Remus sees 6 vultures first, while Romulus later sees 12. The omen is not simple. Is priority more important or number? Which sign matters? Who has the stronger claim? Myth does not always preserve uncertainty by accident. Sometimes uncertainty is the engine. The argument over birds becomes an argument over authority. The heavens are consulted, but human ambition interprets the answer. That is a very Roman problem. Rome placed enormous value on signs, auspices, and divine approval, but signs had to pass through human institutions, human rivalry, human language. The gods might speak through birds, but men still had to decide what the birds meant. Then comes the boundary. Romulus begins to mark the line of the new city. Remus, according to the most famous tradition, mocks it by leaping over the unfinished wall. It is a small action with enormous symbolic weight. A wall that can be jumped is not yet much of a defense, but a sacred boundary is not measured only by height. To cross it in contempt is to insult the city before the city has fully entered the world. Romulus kills him, or one of Romulus's followers kills him. The sources do not all agree. Some versions place the blood directly on Romulus's hands. Others allow a little distance, as if later Roman memory hesitated before making the founder a brother murderer. But even when softened, the stain remains. Remus dies at the threshold of Rome's birth. This is not a side detail. It is the wound in the foundation. The first Roman king is not merely a builder. He is a survivor, an interpreter of omens, a boundary maker, and in the darker tradition, a fratricide. The first city wall is not only raised against enemies outside, it is marked by violence inside the family. Rome's mythology makes a disturbing argument. Order may require exclusion, and exclusion may become bloodshed. That does not mean the Romans celebrated murder in a simple way. The story is more sophisticated than that. It remembers violence and tries to make it meaningful. It converts a brutal struggle into a lesson about sacred borders, authority, destiny, and the cost of founding. A city must have limits. A ruler must be recognized. Mockery of the boundary cannot be harmless if the boundary is what separates civic life from chaos. But there is another reading, quieter and more suspicious. Perhaps the myth is not just explaining why Rome became strong. Perhaps it is confessing something Rome could never entirely solve. The city that prided itself on law, discipline, family duty, and reverence for ancestors began its remembered life with a brother killing a brother. Roman culture would return again and again to civil conflict, elite rivalry, and the terrifying possibility that Rome's greatest enemy was not always outside its walls. Later generations could look back at Romulus and Remus and see not only an origin, but a pattern. The wolf nourished the twins, the river spared them, Mars fathered them, the birds judged them. Yet none of these divine or natural powers prevented the final human act. The gods could authorize Rome, but men would still decide how much blood authority required. That is why the foundation story mattered so much. It did not give Rome a gentle beginning. It gave Rome a usable beginning. A myth that could explain toughness. A myth that could dignify conquest. A myth that could warn against divided rule. A myth that could make sacred the line between inside and outside. And because the story was told and retold across centuries, it did what foundation myths often do. It made memory serve identity. Whether there was a historical Romulus behind the legend remains uncertain. Archaeology can tell us about early settlements on Rome's hills, about huts, burials, walls, and gradual development. It cannot hand us the twins in their basket. It cannot prove the wolf. It cannot recover the moment when one brother crossed a line and the other answered with death. But myth is not powerless because it is uncertain. Sometimes uncertainty allows it to carry more. For Rome, the story of Romulus and Remus made the city feel chosen and dangerous at once. Born of Mars, saved by the wild, confirmed by omens, founded through a boundary, and shadowed by fratricide, Rome could imagine itself as a place where destiny and violence had entered into an old agreement. The marble came later. First came the riverbank. First came the wolf. First came the blood at the wall. Chapter 5. Numa and the invention of sacred order. After the violence of Romulus, Rome needed a different kind of founder. Not another wolf child. Not another son of Mars. Not another man whose authority was born at a wall with blood on it. The figure who enters next in Roman memory is quieter, stranger, and in some ways more revealing. Numa Pompilius, remembered as the second king of Rome, was not celebrated mainly as a conqueror. His power was not imagined through battle, but through restraint. Where Romulus gave Rome its body, Numa gave it rhythm. Where the first king marked the boundary, the second taught the city how to live inside it. At least, that is how later Romans told the story. The historical Numa is difficult to reach. He belongs to the early royal period, a time where legend, political memory, family tradition, and later literary shaping are woven tightly together. We should not treat every detail about him as clean fact. Ancient writers were often explaining the Rome they knew by projecting its institutions backward into a sacred beginning. But even if Numa is partly a remembered king and partly an ideal, the ideal itself matters. Rome wanted to believe that after its birth in violence, it had been disciplined by religion. That desire tells us almost as much as a document would. According to tradition, Numa came from Sabine stock, a detail that is not minor. The Romans liked to imagine their earliest city as a fusion of peoples, not a pure tribe falling from heaven fully formed. Sabine identity gave Numa a kind of outsider-insider quality. He was close enough to rule, but different enough to calm the city's harsher instincts. Ancient accounts describe him as pious, thoughtful, reluctant to accept power, and deeply concerned with divine law. In the language of myth, this reluctance is important. The best sacred ruler is often the one who does not seem hungry for rule. Numa's reign is remembered as a long peace. That may be idealized, but the meaning is clear. Peace was not presented as a pause between wars. It was an achievement requiring structure. Rome had to be trained away from the habits of violence, or at least taught to place those habits under divine supervision. This is the subtle brilliance of the Numa tradition. It does not deny that Rome was dangerous. It tries to domesticate the danger. The gods in this vision were not merely admired, they were handled through order. Numa is credited in later accounts with shaping priesthoods, rituals, religious calendars, sacred offices, and ceremonies that gave Roman life its religious architecture. Some traditions connect him with the pontiffs, the flamines, the salii, the vestals, and other ancient institutions. We should be careful with the word founded, because the growth of Roman religion was almost certainly more gradual and more complicated than one king inventing everything in a burst of holy administration. But Roman memory placed these structures under Numa's name because his name became a symbol of sacred organization. And organization was one of Rome's deepest forms of imagination. Many cultures have myths of divine revelation. Rome had those too, but it also had an extraordinary respect for procedure. The correct day, the correct phrase, the correct official, the correct offering, the correct interpretation of a sign. Religion was not only belief directed upward, it was a system of responsibilities spread through the community. Numa's legend gives that system a human face. There is a famous story, told in different forms, that Numa received guidance from the nymph Egeria. She becomes his divine counselor, a figure of hidden wisdom associated with grove, water, and solitude. Whether we read this as poetic legend, political symbolism, or a memory of older sacred places, it gives Numa's authority a special texture. He does not simply command religion into being. He listens. He withdraws from the city's noise and receives instruction from a presence beyond ordinary politics. That image matters because it softens power without weakening it. A king who claims only military strength can be challenged by stronger soldiers. A king who claims divine instruction speaks from a more difficult place. He becomes the interpreter of an order that existed before argument. In Numa's story, sacred authority does not roar. It murmurs in a grove, then returns to the city as law. This is not merely charming, it is politically intelligent. If Romulus represents the problem of force, Numa represents the solution of form. Human beings are not made peaceful simply by being told to behave. They need repeated habits. They need ceremonies that interrupt appetite. They need calendars that tell them when to work, when to rest, when to remember, when to fear, and when to ask forgiveness. Numa's Rome is a city learning that ritual can shape emotion. A festival can gather a people. A prohibition can slow a hand. A sacred office can turn private anxiety into public order. This is one of the most underestimated functions of mythology. It does not only explain the world, it trains behavior. The calendar was especially powerful. To divide time is to govern it. Days are not all equal once religion enters them. Some days are favorable, others restricted. Some belong to gods, some to civic business, some to memory, some to danger. A society that marks sacred time teaches its citizens to feel that life unfolds within a pattern larger than personal desire. You may want to act, sue, fight, marry, travel, or assemble. The calendar may say no. That no is one of civilization's oldest tools. Numa's religious order also reveals a Roman anxiety that never really disappeared. The fear of doing the right thing in the wrong way. A modern person might think sincerity should matter most. Rome did not ignore sincerity, but it placed tremendous weight on correctness. The gods had to be addressed properly. A vow had to be fulfilled. An omen had to be respected. If a ritual went wrong, it might need to be repeated. The sacred was not casual. There is humility in that, but also control. By turning divine relationship into procedure, Rome made the invisible world administrable. It created offices to manage contact with the gods. It embedded religion into civic life. It gave the state tools to respond when disaster seemed to suggest divine anger. In later centuries, when armies failed or prodigies were reported, Rome would not merely panic. It would consult, sacrifice, vow games, import cults, repeat ceremonies, and attempt to restore the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods. The roots of that mentality are already present in the Numa legend. And yet, the story contains a tension. Sacred order can protect a community from chaos, but it can also become a language of authority. Whoever controls ritual controls access to legitimacy. Whoever knows the calendar knows when action is permitted. Whoever interprets divine signs can slow decisions, approve wars, or cast doubt on political rivals. Religion in Rome was not separate from power. Numa's achievement, if we call it that, was to make power appear answerable to something higher than itself. That was a beautiful idea. It was also a useful one. This is why Numa is so important to the hidden history of Roman mythology. He shows us that Rome's sacred world was not built only from dramatic tales of gods and heroes. It was built from offices, rhythms, restrictions, duties, and remembered gestures. Myth became durable because it entered administration. It found a home not only in poetry, but in schedules, priesthoods, and public acts. The city born from Mars needed more than courage. Courage without ritual becomes appetite. Victory without restraint becomes exhaustion. Boundaries without reverence become lines waiting to be crossed. Numa's legend answers the violence of the foundation by offering a different kind of strength. The strength of repetition, discipline, and sacred patience. Rome would not always live up to that ideal. Few cities do. But it never forgot the claim that order itself had been a gift from the gods, or at least from a king who knew how to speak with them. Chapter 6. The Etruscan Shadow. Before Rome learned to rule the Mediterranean, it learned to look for messages in the sky. A flash of lightning did not simply split the clouds and vanish. It arrived from a direction. It struck a particular place. It appeared at a particular time. To the trained eye, none of that was accidental. A bird crossing above a hill, a strange birth among animals, a sound from the earth, a victim's liver opened after sacrifice. These were not random disturbances in an otherwise silent world. They were signals, and long before Rome presented itself as the master of Italy, it had listened closely to a people who seemed to know how to read them. The Etruscans remain one of the great presences behind early Rome, near, influential, and still partly veiled. They lived to the north of Rome, in the region later known as Etruria, with powerful city-states, wealthy tombs, skilled metalwork, complex religious customs, and an artistic imagination that left vivid traces in painted burial chambers. Their language is still only partly understood, which has helped preserve their reputation as mysterious. But mystery should not become laziness. The Etruscans were not ghosts drifting around Roman history. They were neighbors, rivals, teachers, and at times, rulers. According to Roman tradition, some of Rome's kings were connected with Etruscan power, especially the Tarquins. The historical details are debated, as they often are for the early royal period, but the larger point is difficult to deny. Rome absorbed deeply from Etruscan culture before it became the Rome we think we know. One of the strongest areas of influence was sacred knowledge. The Romans later spoke of the Disciplina Etrusca, the Etruscan discipline, a body of ritual expertise concerned with interpreting divine signs. This included the reading of lightning, the interpretation of prodigies, and the examination of entrails, especially the liver after sacrifice. To modern ears, this can sound strange, even theatrical, but to ancient communities, divination was not entertainment. It was a practical art of decision-making in a world where divine displeasure could be fatal. The point was not to predict the future like a street magician. The point was to understand whether human action aligned with divine will. That distinction matters. Roman religion was not built on the idea that humans should simply wait passively for fate. Romans acted aggressively, built roads, raised armies, argued in assemblies, founded colonies, and negotiated treaties. But action required permission, or at least it required the appearance of permission. Before a public decision could carry full, sacred confidence, the city needed signs that the gods had not turned away. The Etruscans helped refine that habit into a language. Lightning, for example, was not treated as one kind of omen with one fixed meaning. Its direction, location, and circumstances mattered. The sky became a mapped surface. The heavens could be divided, interpreted, and read according to sacred expertise. This is a very old and very human impulse. When the world feels dangerous, we draw lines across it. We make patterns. We create systems that allow fear to become knowledge, or at least something that looks enough like knowledge to let us continue. Rome was especially good at that. From the Etruscan world came not only techniques, but a mood of religious seriousness. The gods were not vague symbols of nature. They communicated, they warned, they could be angered. Their signs needed specialists, and specialists needed authority. In this way, divination created a bridge between terror and administration. A thunderbolt might fall from the sky, but a trained interpreter could bring it into civic order. That is one of Rome's most revealing transformations. The uncanny was rarely allowed to remain merely uncanny. It was given an office, a rule, a procedure, a response. Haruspicy, the inspection of entrails, shows this clearly. The image can feel disturbing, but in the ancient world, the sacrificed animal's body became a kind of sacred document. Its liver, shape, marks, and irregularities could be studied as signs. A famous bronze model of a liver from Piacenza, though Etruscan rather than Roman, gives a glimpse of how organized this sacred imagination could become. The organ divided into labeled regions associated with divine powers. It is a reminder that this was not casual superstition in the minds of its practitioners. It was structured knowledge, taught and preserved. Of course, we have to be careful. We cannot reconstruct every ritual in full detail, and later Roman authors sometimes described Etruscan religion through Roman assumptions. What survives is filtered. Some details are fragmentary. Some may be idealized. But the Roman respect for Etruscan divination is clear enough. In moments of crisis, Rome could call on Etruscan experts to interpret prodigies and advise on ritual repair. That is a remarkable thing for a proud city. Rome conquered and absorbed, but it also borrowed without embarrassment, when borrowing strengthened the state. This is one reason Roman religion became so durable. It did not depend on purity. It depended on usefulness, antiquity, and authority. If another people possessed a sacred technique that seemed effective, Rome could bring it inside the walls, translate it into Roman procedure, and make it part of a larger system. The same pattern appears in sacred architecture. The Etruscans influenced temple design in Italy. High podiums, deep front porches, frontal emphasis, richly decorated terracotta roofs, and a strong sense that a temple faced the worshipper as much as it housed the god. Roman temples would later develop through many influences, including Greek forms. But the Etruscan contribution belongs to the older Italian texture of Roman sacred space. It gave the gods a public stage, raised above the civic world, visible and formal, yet still rooted in local tradition. A temple was not simply a beautiful container. It was a marked place where heaven and city could meet under rules. The Roman word templum originally carried the sense of a space marked out for sacred observation, especially by an augur. That detail is worth lingering over. Sacred space begins not only with building, but with division. A portion of the sky, a portion of land, a place set apart so signs can be seen and interpreted. The act of marking the sacred is already an act of power. It says, "Here meaning will be watched." This brings us back to the Etruscan shadow. It was not only a shadow of influence, it was a shadow in the older sense, a shape cast across Rome's imagination. From Etruria, Rome encountered a more elaborate discipline of omens, a more technical fear of divine signs, a sense that the world was written in flashes, flights, organs, and anomalies. This did not replace the older Roman concern with hearth, boundary, and household spirit. It enlarged it. It gave the city a wider sky to read. And there is something almost ironic here. Rome would later become famous for its confidence, its armies, roads, laws, engineering, and brutal political certainty. Yet beneath that confidence was an anxious habit of asking permission. Before battle, before office, before public action, before recovery from disaster, Rome kept returning to signs. It did not see power and piety as opposites. It saw piety as part of power. The Etruscans helped teach Rome that the gods could be negotiated with, but not ignored. They also helped teach Rome that fear could be organized. A strange event did not have to remain a bad dream. It could be reported, classified, interpreted, and answered. Lightning could become instruction. A prodigy could become ritual. An omen could become policy. Long before Rome absorbed Greece's radiant stories, before it clothed its gods in familiar human faces, it had absorbed something older from the Italian earth around it. The belief that the unseen world was constantly speaking, and that survival belonged to those who knew the grammar. Rome did not invent all its mysteries. Some of them came from the north, carrying thunder in their hands. Chapter 7. The Capitoline gods take their thrones. At some point, Rome's sacred world had to climb out of the household and stand above the city. Not because the hearth became unimportant. It never did. Not because the ancestral spirits faded away. They remained close, stubborn, and necessary. But a growing city needed more than domestic guardians and local omens. It needed gods who could hold the weight of public life. Law, war, magistracy, civic identity, triumph, fear, and ambition. It needed gods who could look like the state. And so, on the Capitoline Hill, Roman religion took on one of its most important public shapes. The Capitoline Triad, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, became central to Rome's civic imagination. Their temple, traditionally associated with the late royal period and dedicated in the early Republic, stood as more than a religious building. It was a declaration. Rome was no longer only a cluster of families, fields, thresholds, and old local powers. It was a community that could gather its destiny under a shared divine roof. Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Jupiter best and greatest, stood at the center of that vision. He was not merely a thunder god borrowed into Roman dress. In Rome, Jupiter became the divine witness of public authority. Oaths belonged under his gaze. Victories were owed to him. Triumphing generals climbed toward his temple after conquest, carrying spoils, glory, and the dangerous intoxication of success. In that movement uphill, Roman power performed one of its essential gestures. It returned victory to the god, at least symbolically, before any man could claim too much of it for himself. That symbolism mattered. Rome admired great men, but it feared uncontrolled greatness. A general who won too much could begin to look larger than the Republic. A commander loved by soldiers, enriched by plunder, praised by crowds, and crowned in triumph, was both useful and dangerous. By placing Jupiter above the celebration, Rome reminded itself that human glory needed a divine ceiling. The victor might ride like a king for a day, but the god remained seated. This is one of the subtler functions of Roman mythology. It did not only inflate power, it restrained it, or tried to. The gods could decorate ambition, but they could also limit it. Jupiter's presence gave Rome a sacred language for authority. Yet that same presence implied that authority was not supposed to be purely personal. The state stood beneath the god. The magistrate served beneath the god. Even victory had to bow. Beside Jupiter stood Juno, whose role in Roman religion cannot be reduced to the jealous wife familiar from Greek-influenced stories. In the public life of Rome, Juno carried meanings of protection, womanhood, marriage, fertility, and the life of the community. She was connected to the stability of households, yes, but also to the civic body that households formed together. If Jupiter represented a visible summit of sovereignty, Juno helped bind that sovereignty to continuity, to birth, alliance, rank, and the guarded future of Roman society. Minerva completed the triad with a different quality, associated with skill, craft, intelligence, and strategic wisdom. She brought to the Capitoline grouping a sharper, more technical force. A city does not endure by courage alone. It needs judgment. It needs craft. It needs the practical intelligence that turns force into lasting structure. Minerva's presence suggests that Roman public identity was not simply martial. It was administrative, legal, artisanal, disciplined. Together, these gods formed a sacred image of the city's ideal self. That is the key. The Capitoline Triad was not just a collection of divine personalities. It was a portrait of Rome as Rome wanted to understand itself. Sovereign, fertile, ordered, skilled, victorious, lawful, and protected. The gods did not merely receive worship from the state. They helped define what the state thought it was, and this is why the hill matters. A sacred place is never only a place. The Capitoline was elevated, visible, and politically charged. To climb it was to move from the ordinary ground of the city toward the symbolic height of Roman identity. Temples do this kind of work quietly. They arrange space so that belief becomes movement. You do not just think the state is sacred. You walk uphill to enact it. You see the temple from below. You know where victory must go. You know where vows must be paid. The temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus also carried the memory of kingship into the Republic in a complicated way. Roman tradition associated its construction with the Tarquins, Rome's last kings, whose expulsion became the great political trauma out of which the Republic defined itself. This meant that one of the Republic's central sacred monuments had royal roots. That is not a contradiction to be smoothed away too quickly. It reveals how Rome often handled its past, not by erasing dangerous inheritances, but by repurposing them. The Republic could reject kings while keeping a kingly temple. It could transform royal sacred architecture into Republican civic authority. It could take the grandeur of monarchy and place it in service to magistrates, senate, people, and gods. Rome was skilled at this kind of conversion. The past was rarely wasted. Even what had to be condemned could be absorbed, renamed, and made useful. Here again, mythology and statecraft are inseparable. When Roman officials made vows to Jupiter, when generals dedicated spoils, when public rituals unfolded around the Capitoline gods, the city was not merely expressing piety, it was staging legitimacy. It was teaching citizens where authority came from and where it had to return. Religion gave politics height, continuity, and warning. A law might be debated, an election might be contested, a military campaign might be risky. But if these things could be placed beneath divine guardianship, they entered a larger order. This did not make Roman politics pure. No religion has ever managed that for long. Ambitious men could use sacred language while pursuing very human goals. Priests could belong to elite families. Omens could be interpreted within political pressure. Public piety could become performance. Rome was perfectly capable of mixing reverence with advantage, but that mixture is exactly what makes it so revealing. The gods on the Capitoline were not floating above Roman history untouched by it. They were inside the machinery. Their worship shaped how Rome imagined consent, victory, duty, and crisis. When something went wrong, a defeat, a plague, a frightening omen, the question was not only practical, it was theological. Had the gods been offended? Had the rituals failed? Had the city neglected a vow? Was Rome still in right relationship with the powers that guarded it? The Capitoline gods made those questions public. A household could worry about its dead, its door, its fire, its stores. The state worried in larger form. Its hearth was civic unity. Its threshold was the boundary of Roman power. Its ancestors were founders and heroes. Its storehouse was the grain supply. Its family quarrels were political crises. And above it stood Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, turning the city itself into a kind of enormous household under divine supervision. That is why this development feels like a turning point. The old sacred habits did not disappear. They scaled upward. The logic of the household shrine found its monumental counterpart on the hill. The careful negotiation with unseen powers became a public institution. The anxiety of survival became the theology of a state. Rome's gods had taken their thrones, but they were not merely sitting there, waiting for prayers. They were watching the city become powerful enough to frighten itself. Chapter 8. Greece enters the Roman dream. There comes a moment in Rome's sacred history when the gods begin to look more human. They acquire sharper faces, fuller biographies, affairs, rivalries, disguises, grudges, wounds to their pride. They begin to enter stories with scenes and dialogue, with motives we can almost recognize. Jupiter becomes easier to imagine because Zeus is standing behind him. Venus glows with the dangerous beauty of Aphrodite. Neptune rises with the force of Poseidon. Mars is compared to Ares, though the comparison never fits perfectly. Minerva draws near to Athena, carrying wisdom, skill, and a hard brightness of mind. To a modern listener, this may sound like the moment Roman mythology finally becomes mythology. But that is our bias showing. The older Roman sacred world was not empty just because it was less theatrical. It did not lack depth because it lacked a crowded family drama on a Greek mountain. It had its own grammar, noumena, rites, boundaries, vows, household gods, ancestral duties, divine signs, sacred calendars. What Greece offered Rome was not religion itself, but narrative abundance. The gods became easier to paint, easier to sculpt, easier to put into poetry, easier to remember as characters. And once gods become characters, they can travel farther. Greek culture entered Rome over centuries, through trade, colonization in southern Italy, conquest, diplomacy, education, art, and literature. Rome did not suddenly wake up one morning and decide to become Greek. The process was long, uneven, and sometimes uncomfortable. Greek cities had been present in southern Italy and Sicily long before Rome became mistress of the Mediterranean. Greek stories, images, and cults reached Italian peoples through many routes. Later, as Rome expanded, it encountered Greek culture not as a distant influence, but as a powerful inheritance waiting inside the world it had conquered. This produced one of the great tensions in Roman identity. Rome admired Greece deeply. It also wanted to dominate it. It borrowed from Greek art, philosophy, education, and mythology, while sometimes accusing Greek culture of luxury, cleverness, softness, or moral danger. Roman elites could study Greek literature and then complain that Greek habits were corrupting the old Roman character. This is not hypocrisy exactly. It is the anxiety of a conqueror being conquered in imagination. The gods were part of that anxiety. When Jupiter was identified with Zeus, something useful happened. Roman religion gained access to an enormous body of Greek mythic material. The Olympian order, the divine family, the battles against older powers, the love affairs, punishments, transformations, and heroic lineages. A god who had been central to Roman public authority could now be placed inside stories that gave him a past, a temperament, and a recognizable mythology. But something was also lost, or at least blurred. Jupiter was not simply Zeus with a Latin name. In Roman public life, Jupiter Optimus Maximus carried a particular civic authority. He was bound to oaths, triumphs, law, and the state's relationship with divine approval. Zeus could illuminate him, but not exhaust him. The same problem appears with Mars. Greek Ares is often a figure of violent frenzy, disliked even among the gods in some Greek traditions. Roman Mars was more than battle rage. He was connected to agriculture in older layers, to protection, fatherhood, Roman identity, and the origin of the city through Romulus. To equate Mars with Ares is convenient. It is not complete. This is why the phrase Roman versions of Greek gods can be misleading. It makes Rome sound like a student copying homework from a brighter classmate. The truth is more interesting. Rome practiced translation, but translation changes both languages. A Greek story placed on a Roman god did not remain purely Greek. It acquired Roman weight. It could be attached to Roman families, Roman rituals, Roman political claims, Roman festivals, Roman monuments. The imported myth became part of a different machine. Venus is a perfect example. As Aphrodite's counterpart, she could inherit stories of beauty, desire, seduction, jealousy, and divine charm. But in Rome, Venus also became a figure of ancestry and power. Through the Trojan hero Aeneas and his mother Venus, Rome could imagine itself as descended from divine and heroic blood. That is not merely a love goddess taking on a local costume. That is desire being transformed into dynastic legitimacy. Myth changed job descriptions when it entered Rome. Greek mythology was extraordinarily good at making gods psychologically vivid. Roman religion was extraordinarily good at making gods institutionally useful. When the two met, the result was not simple imitation. It was fusion, friction, and selective memory. The Romans took what served them, adapted what could be adapted, and sometimes lived with contradictions that no one fully solved. One contradiction was moral. Greek myths often show gods behaving badly. They deceive, rage, lust, punish disproportionately, and violate the boundaries humans are told to respect. For poets, artists, and storytellers, this makes them fascinating. For a state religion concerned with order, oaths, and civic discipline, it can be awkward. What happens when the god who guards law is also known through stories of disguise and betrayal? What happens when divine ancestry rests on tales that, looked at too closely, are morally troubling? Rome did not solve this by rejecting the stories. It layered them. A Roman could encounter Jupiter in a solemn public vow, and also know Greek-style stories of Zeus's affairs. These were not always felt as contradictions in the modern sense, because ancient religion did not demand one tidy theological profile for every deity. Gods had different faces in different contexts. A god in ritual, a god in poetry, a god in household devotion, and a god in political symbolism could overlap without becoming identical. That flexibility gave Roman mythology enormous strength. It could absorb without collapsing. It could allow a farmer's ritual, a senator's vow, a poet's erotic myth, a general's triumph, and a sculptor's Greek-inspired statue to exist in the same religious universe. Not peacefully always, not logically always, but effectively. Roman mythology became less like a single book and more like a city, old walls beside new temples, local shrines beside imported cults, official ceremonies beside private devotions. The Greek influence also made Roman myth more exportable. A statue of Jupiter in a Zeus-like form could be understood across a Mediterranean world shaped by Greek visual language. Roman power could present itself through divine images that conquered peoples already knew how to read. This mattered. Empire depends not only on armies, but on symbols that travel. Greek myth gave Rome a shared mythological vocabulary. Yet beneath that vocabulary, older Roman instincts remained. The prayer still had to be spoken correctly. The omen still mattered. The vow still bound the state. The ancestral dead still pressed on family memory. The threshold still required attention. Rome might dress its gods in Greek stories, but it did not forget that religion was also a discipline of action. This is the deepest point about Greece entering the Roman dream. It did not replace the dream. It made it more vivid, more elegant, more dangerous. Because once Roman gods had Greek faces, Roman ambition could speak in a grander mythic language. Political leaders could compare themselves with heroes. Families could trace lines into divine narrative. Cities could be founded with stories that connected them to Troy, Olympus, and destiny. Conquest could appear not only as strategy, but as the unfolding of a sacred past. The gods had become more beautiful. They had also become more useful. And perhaps that is why Rome never fully chose between its old ritual seriousness and its imported mythic imagination. It wanted both. The procedure that kept the gods in agreement, and the stories that made the gods unforgettable. One gave Rome order, the other gave Rome dreams. Together, they gave Rome a mythology large enough to follow its armies across the sea. Chapter 9. Aeneas, the Trojan ghost of Rome. Rome did not only want a beginning, it wanted an ancestry. The story of Romulus and Remus gave the city blood, danger, and a wall. It explained why Rome could imagine itself as fierce, boundary-conscious, born under Mars and hardened by violence. But that was not enough for a people who would one day rule far beyond the hills of the Tiber. A local foundation could tell Rome where its stones were laid. It could not, by itself, give Rome a place inside the older sacred memory of the Mediterranean. For that, Rome turned east, to Troy. The choice was brilliant and not innocent. Troy was a defeated city, but not a shameful one. In Greek epic, Troy had fallen after a war of terrible beauty and grief, a war filled with heroes, gods, betrayals, and impossible choices. To claim descent from Troy was to claim a past older and grander than Rome itself. It allowed Rome to step into the light of Homeric memory, not as a Greek city, but as the heir of a world Greece had destroyed. At the center of this claim stood Aeneas. He was not the loudest hero in the Trojan War. He was not Achilles, burning with rage. He was not Odysseus, turning survival into an art form. Aeneas was something different, a survivor carrying obligation on his back. In the most famous image associated with him, he escapes burning Troy with his father Anchises on his shoulders, his young son beside him, and the household gods of Troy preserved for a future he cannot yet see. That image matters because it is almost painfully Roman. Aeneas is not simply saving himself. He is carrying the past, protecting the future, and preserving the sacred center of a destroyed home. Father, son, gods, memory, continuity, duty, the ruined city behind him, the unknown destiny ahead. If Romulus gives Rome the myth of founding through force, Aeneas gives it the myth of survival through responsibility. The contrast is important. Romulus kills his brother at the boundary of a new city. Aeneas carries his father out of a dying one. One myth explains the violence required to begin. The other explains the burden required to continue. Later, Roman tradition connected Aeneas's journey to Italy, where his descendants would eventually lead to the line of Romulus and Remus. The details differ across sources and grew richer over time. Greek writers had already explored versions of Trojan survivors reaching the West, and Italian communities had their own local traditions. Rome did not invent the Trojan connection in a single moment. It gathered, shaped, and elevated it. By the Augustan age, especially through Virgil's Aeneid, the story became one of the great statements of Roman destiny. But before it became imperial poetry, it was already doing political work. The Trojan origin gave Rome a deeper past. It suggested that Rome was not a sudden upstart, not merely a tough Italian city that had bullied its way to greatness. It was the delayed answer to an ancient catastrophe. Troy had burned, but its sacred line had not ended. Its gods had crossed the sea. Its suffering had been stored, carried, and transformed into future power. This is one of the strange moral movements of Roman mythology. Defeat becomes authorization. Aeneas does not inherit victory. He inherits loss. He leaves behind a city that cannot be saved, and that failure becomes the seed of a greater mission. The story teaches that history may conceal purpose inside disaster. A burning city, a wandering exile, a broken people. These are not the end. They are the painful route by which fate changes location. Of course, we should be cautious. Aeneas is a mythic figure, not a recoverable historical founder in the ordinary sense. We cannot follow his footprints across the Mediterranean as if reading a military itinerary. The journey belongs to legend, poetry, and political imagination. But myths do not need to be factual in every detail to become historically powerful. What matters is what people use them to explain, justify, and feel. And Rome used Aeneas to feel chosen, not chosen in a gentle way. The Roman sense of destiny often came with sacrifice attached. Aeneas is repeatedly defined by what he must give up. Personal desire bends beneath obligation. Private grief is absorbed into public future. Love, home, comfort, and even tenderness are made secondary to something larger. That is why Aeneas could become such a useful Roman hero. He is not free in the modern romantic sense. He is bound. The Latin word often associated with him is pietas. It is difficult to translate cleanly. It means duty, devotion, reverence, loyalty to gods, family, and country. It is not mere kindness. It is not simple piety in the narrow religious sense. It is the disciplined recognition that one's life is tied to obligations older and larger than the self. Aeneas embodies that quality so strongly that he can seem, to some modern readers, less vivid than more rebellious heroes. Achilles burns brighter. Odysseus thinks faster. Dido, in Virgil's telling, may feel more emotionally immediate than Aeneas himself. But that is part of the point. Aeneas is not designed to charm us with freedom. He is designed to trouble us with duty. Rome admired that. Or at least Rome wanted to admire that. The story also allowed Roman power to present itself as something more than conquest. If Rome descended from Troy, then its expansion could be imagined as the unfolding of fate rather than mere appetite. The gods had not simply permitted Rome to grow, they had prepared it through centuries of wandering, suffering, and sacred inheritance. This kind of story is dangerous precisely because it is beautiful. It turns ambition into destiny. It makes victory feel like repayment. And yet, the Aeneas myth is not crude propaganda when handled well. Its emotional power comes from the fact that destiny costs something. Troy is not a convenient decoration. It is a wound. Aeneas does not stroll toward empire smiling. He leaves ashes, buries companions, loses people, and carries sorrow like another household god. The future Rome is glorious, but it is built out of mourning. That gives the myth its darker intelligence. Roman greatness, in this tradition, is not born from innocence. It is born from a chain of losses made meaningful after the fact. The survivor becomes founder. The refugee becomes ancestor. The defeated become the seed of conquerors. There is grandeur in that, and also a warning. A people who believes its pain has been converted into destiny may become very difficult to stop. The Trojan story also helped Rome compete with Greece on symbolic ground. Greece had the epics. Greece had the old heroic language. Greece had Troy as the great stage on which heroes proved themselves. By claiming Aeneas, Rome entered that stage from another door. It did not need to be Greek to inherit epic significance. It could say, yes, your poets sang the fall of Troy, but we carry what survived it. That is a powerful reversal. It lets Rome stand both inside and outside Greek memory. Rome can admire Homer while quietly answering him. It can borrow the prestige of the Trojan War without becoming subordinate to Greek identity. In mythic terms, Rome becomes the future that Greek victory did not foresee. And so Aeneas moves through Roman imagination like a ghost from an older world. He is not the founder standing at the wall. He is the ancestor before the ancestor, the sacred exile whose burden makes later history possible. Through him, the household shrine becomes international. The Penates of Troy become the promise of Rome. The ruined home becomes the seed of a city that will claim the world. This is why Aeneas matters. He gave Rome a past deeper than its own memory. He gave Roman ambition the language of sacrifice, and he allowed a city of wolves, omens, hearthfires, and sacred boundaries to imagine that its destiny had begun not on the banks of the Tiber, but in the smoke of a fallen Troy. Chapter 10. The Republic and the Fear of Divine Anger. The Roman Republic was not governed by reason alone. It liked to imagine itself as disciplined, legal, austere, suspicious of kings, and guided by ancestral custom. Its citizens praised courage, restraint, duty, and public service. Its magistrates wore authority for a limited time, then returned it. Its Senate debated policy in the language of experience and rank. Its armies marched beneath standards, roads, and command structures that could make Roman power look almost mechanical. But beneath that hard public surface was an old anxiety. What if disaster was not only disaster? What if a lost battle, a plague, a famine, a lightning strike, a monstrous birth, or a strange report from the countryside meant that Rome had offended the gods? This fear was not a minor superstition at the edge of public life. It was woven into the Republic's understanding of survival. The Romans believed, in broad terms, that the city's safety depended on maintaining the pax deorum, the peace or right relationship with the gods. That phrase can sound gentle, as if the gods were kindly neighbors who only wanted polite attention. But the Roman version was more severe. Peace with the gods was not an emotion. It was a condition that had to be maintained through correct ritual, fulfilled vows, public discipline, and constant vigilance. When things went wrong, Rome asked a dangerous question: where did we fail? That question gave religion immense political force. A military defeat might be explained by poor strategy, weak leadership, bad terrain, or enemy skill. The Romans were practical enough to see those things, but they also considered whether the divine order had been disturbed. Had a ritual been neglected? Had a vow gone unpaid? Had a magistrate taken office under flawed auspices? Had the gods sent warnings that the city misunderstood or ignored? In a modern state, crisis often produces investigations, resignations, reforms, and accusations. In Rome, it could also produce sacrifices, vows, sacred games, consultation of priests, and the formal reporting of prodigies. The boundary between public policy and sacred repair was thin because the state itself lived under divine supervision. Prodigies were especially important. These were unusual events interpreted as signs of divine displeasure or warning. Ancient accounts record reports of strange lights, animals behaving unnaturally, lightning striking temples, rivers flooding, statues sweating or bleeding, and other unsettling occurrences. We should not read every report as straightforward fact. Some may have been exaggerated, misunderstood, shaped by rumor, or recorded later through literary convention. But their factual precision is not the only point. What matters is that Roman society possessed a category for such events and a public process for responding to them. Fear was given paperwork. That may sound dry, but it is one of Rome's most revealing gifts to history. A frightening omen did not remain only a village story whispered after sunset. It could be reported, evaluated, accepted or rejected, and answered with ritual action. The Senate might order ceremonies, priests might be consulted, sacrifices might be performed, games might be vowed. Foreign rites might even be brought in if the crisis seemed to demand something beyond the familiar religious toolkit. Rome did not treat divine anger as purely private. It made divine anger a matter of state. This tells us something crucial about Roman mythology. The gods were not merely characters in old tales. They were political actors in a broad sense, not because they sat in the Senate, but because their perceived favor or displeasure shaped decisions. To say that the gods were angry could explain suffering, but it could also direct public behavior. It could unify people in ritual response. It could protect leaders by shifting blame onto ritual failure, or expose leaders by suggesting that their authority had been polluted from the beginning. A consul might command soldiers, but if the auspices were flawed, command itself could be shadowed. The Republic's obsession with auspices was not ornamental. Before major public acts, especially those involving magistrates and war, divine approval was sought through signs. Birds, sacred chickens, lightning, and other forms of omen could become part of political procedure. This is where the Roman sacred system becomes both impressive and uncomfortable. On one hand, it restrained action. It reminded ambitious men that power required sanction beyond appetite. On the other hand, it created opportunities for delay, manipulation, and strategic piety. If signs mattered, then those who interpreted signs mattered very much. The Romans knew this tension. They lived inside it. Religion could be sincere and useful at the same time. That is difficult for modern people to hold together because we often assume that usefulness cancels sincerity. But in Rome, a ritual could be politically convenient and still deeply serious. A public sacrifice could calm the people, reinforce senatorial authority, and genuinely seek divine favor. These motives did not have to exclude one another. Roman religion worked partly because it did several things at once. It gave meaning to fear. It offered procedures for crisis. It made the state appear humble before the gods, even when the state was becoming terrifyingly powerful. Sacred games show this mixture clearly. Games could be vowed in moments of danger and fulfilled as offerings to the gods. They were religious acts, civic gatherings, political spectacles, and emotional releases. The city watched, celebrated, remembered, and reassured itself that the proper relationship with divine powers was being restored. Entertainment and expiation were not separate worlds. The crowd's pleasure could exist within a sacred bargain. This may feel strange until we remember that public ritual has always done more than one job. A ceremony can mourn, discipline, distract, legitimize, and heal all at once. Rome understood this long before modern states learned to televise national grief. The Republic also developed a remarkable talent for religious adaptation in crisis. When familiar rites seemed insufficient, Rome could consult sacred books, bring in new cults, or honor foreign gods under Roman authority. This was not a sign of weakness. It was a strategy of survival. The Republic's religion was conservative in posture, but flexible in practice. It revered ancestral ways, yet it could expand the sacred system when fear required it. That flexibility would later help Rome absorb gods from across the Mediterranean. But even in the Republic, the pattern was visible. If the gods were angry, the city had to respond. If the old response failed, a new one might be found. There is a darker side to this. A society that sees disaster as divine warning may become more morally alert, but also more anxious. Every defeat can become an accusation. Every irregular birth, every lightning strike, every failed harvest can feel like evidence in an invisible trial. Rome's religious system offered control, but it also trained the public to search for hidden causes. The gods were protectors, but they were also auditors. Nothing was ever merely unfortunate for long. And yet, this fear helped make Rome formidable. A state that believes its survival depends on ritual correctness will develop habits of memory. It will keep records. It will honor vows. It will repeat ceremonies. It will treat public failure as something that demands repair, not only explanation. Even when the repair seems strange to us, the underlying instinct is recognizable. crisis must be answered. The community must do something together. The Republic's gods were not always kind, but they gave Rome a framework for endurance. When the city trembled, it did not only look to generals, it looked to priests, omens, calendars, vows, and the old difficult question of whether Rome was still in balance with the powers beneath and above it. That question could be exploited, certainly. It could be politicized. It could be misunderstood. But it also kept alive the belief that power carried obligation. The Republic feared divine anger because it believed Rome was not alone in history. Every law, every campaign, every election, every triumph unfolded under a crowded sky. And somewhere beyond the noise of speeches and marching feet, the gods were still being asked whether the city had permission to continue. Chapter 11. Foreign gods behind Roman gates. Rome did not survive by keeping its gods untouched. That may be one of the most important things to understand about Roman mythology. It was not a sealed temple with one guarded door. It was more like the city itself, layered, noisy, disciplined in public, flexible in practice, and surprisingly willing to make room for strangers when the need became great enough. As Rome expanded, it did not simply conquer lands. It entered sacred environments older than its own authority. Every new people had gods, rites, holy places, healing powers, protectors, ancestral cults, local mysteries, and divine names that did not always translate cleanly into Latin. A less practical empire might have tried to erase them all. Rome often preferred a different method. It swallowed. Not always gently, not always respectfully in the modern sense, but it absorbed, renamed, regulated, and repositioned foreign gods inside a Roman world. This was not mere tolerance, and it was not modern religious freedom. It was strategy. A god who remained outside Rome's order could be unsettling. A god brought inside the gates, given a festival, a temple, a priesthood, or a controlled ritual place, could become part of the system. Rome had learned long before that fear could be organized. Now it learned that foreign holiness could be organized too. Apollo gives one early and important example of this process. Though Greek in origin, Apollo entered Roman religious life as a god of healing, purification, prophecy, and later artistic and political resonance. His presence shows that Rome was not allergic to Greek divinity even before Greek thought fully transformed the Roman imagination. In times of illness or crisis, a healing god mattered. Elegance could come later. First came need. This is a recurring pattern. Foreign gods often entered Rome not as ornaments, but as answers. When the old religious machinery seemed insufficient, Rome could look outward. That outward glance was not a confession that Roman religion had failed. It was almost the opposite. The Roman system was confident enough to expand itself. If the divine world was vast, then no single city owned all its powers. A wise city learned which powers to invite, which to regulate, and which to fear. The arrival of Cybele, the Great Mother, makes the pattern vivid. During the Second Punic War, when Hannibal's presence in Italy placed Rome under extraordinary pressure, Roman tradition says that sacred consultation led to the importation of the Magna Mater from Asia Minor. Her black sacred stone was brought to Rome with great ceremony. The symbolism was powerful. At a moment when Rome felt threatened by a foreign enemy, it brought in a foreign mother. That is not a small irony. Cybele's cult carried elements that Romans found both compelling and uncomfortable. Her ecstatic worship, her foreign attendance, and the intensity surrounding her rites did not fit neatly into older Roman restraint. Rome wanted her power, but it also wanted control over how that power appeared in public life. So the Great Mother entered, but under rules. She was honored, housed, celebrated, and watched. This is Rome at its most revealing, deeply conservative and radically adaptive in the same breath. It could bring an Anatolian goddess into the heart of the city, while insisting that her worship be made compatible with Roman order. The foreign did not have to remain foreign if Rome could frame it properly. A dangerous, sacred energy could be converted into civic protection. The alien mother could become Rome's mother, or at least a mother Rome could use. Later, as Rome's reach widened across the eastern Mediterranean, Egyptian religion also entered the Roman world, especially through the cult of Isis. Isis offered something different from the old public gods of the Capitoline. Her worship could feel personal, salvific, emotionally rich, and cosmopolitan. She was a goddess of motherhood, magic, protection, mourning, and restoration, with a mythic world that spoke to people across languages and borders. Roman reactions to Isis were not simple. At times, her cult faced suspicion or restriction. At other times, it flourished. That tension is exactly what we should expect. Foreign gods could attract devotion from people who felt underserved by formal civic religion. They could cross social lines. They could create communities of worship not entirely dependent on old Roman family structures or state ritual. That made them powerful. It also made them politically delicate. A god who comforts ordinary people can become more than a god. He or she can become an alternate center of loyalty. Mithras, whose cult spread especially among soldiers and officials in the imperial period, shows another kind of foreign sacred appeal. His mysteries were not public civic festivals in the old Roman style. They involved initiation, ritual fellowship, symbolic imagery, and enclosed sacred spaces. Much about Mithraic practice remains debated, and the evidence does not allow every detail to be reconstructed with confidence. But the broad attraction is understandable. In an empire of movement, hierarchy, danger, and military service, a mystery cult could offer belonging that felt intense, chosen, and sealed. That word, mystery, matters. The older Roman religious system had been remarkably public. Its great rites were visible, civic, formal, and tied to offices. Mystery cults offered something more inward, though not necessarily private in the modern sense. They created levels of participation. They suggested that sacred knowledge could be entered gradually, through initiation. For many people in the empire, this may have answered a hunger that state ritual did not fully feed. Rome could give you citizenship, law, roads, grain, spectacle, and the protection of public gods. But the soul may ask for other rooms. This does not mean that foreign cults replaced traditional Roman religion in one sudden wave. The old gods remained. Jupiter did not step down because Isis arrived. Vesta's fire did not vanish because Mithras gathered initiates underground. Roman religious life became layered. A person could participate in public festivals, honor household gods, respect the emperor's cult, and feel drawn to a foreign mystery all within the same broad world. Ancient religion was often less exclusive than later categories lead us to expect. That layering is one reason Roman mythology became so difficult to define. Was it the old noumena of the field and threshold? Yes. Was it the Greek-shaped stories of Jupiter, Venus, Mars, and Neptune? Yes. Was it the Trojan destiny of Aeneas? Yes. Was it Cybele's foreign motherhood? Isis's promise of restoration? Mithras's initiatory brotherhood? Apollo's healing light? Also yes. Rome's mythology was not a single clean genealogy. It was an empire of sacred meanings. But absorption always has a cost. When a culture brings in foreign gods, it changes them, and it changes itself. Cybele in Rome was not simply Cybele in Anatolia. Isis in a Roman city was not simply Isis in Egypt. Mithras in the Roman Empire was not simply an Iranian god carried unchanged into Latin stone. These cults were translated into new environments, new languages, new social needs. The result was neither pure preservation nor simple theft. It was transformation, and transformation can be both creative and violent. Rome's religious genius was its ability to make room without surrendering the frame. Foreign gods could enter, but Rome decided where they stood. Their rights could be honored, but also supervised. Their power could be welcomed, but only after being made legible to Roman authority. The sacred languages of others were not always silenced. They were incorporated into a larger grammar. That is why Roman mythology survived expansion. It did not break when the world grew larger. It grew larger with the world. The city that once feared the forces at its own door now opened gates to gods from across seas and deserts. Some came during crisis. Some came with merchants. Some came with soldiers. Some came through slaves, freed people, migrants, diplomats, and aristocrats with fashionable tastes. They arrived with music, symbols, initiations, healing rites, strange images, and promises that older Roman forms could not always provide. And Rome, cautious but hungry, made space. Not because it had lost faith in its gods, but because it believed power could be gathered. The empire collected provinces, taxes, grain, soldiers, statues, stories, and sacred names. To rule the world, Rome had to persuade itself that the world's gods could live under Roman skies. So the gates opened, and behind them came the divine strangers. Chapter 12. Venus, Mars, and the Myth of Power. Power rarely introduces itself as ambition. It prefers older words: duty, ancestry, destiny, service, restoration, the will of the gods. In Rome, where family memory already carried sacred weight and public life unfolded beneath divine signs, those words could become extraordinarily useful. A man who wanted office was one thing. A man whose blood seemed to flow from Venus, Mars, or Hercules was something else entirely. He was not merely competing, he was returning. This is where Roman mythology moves from the shrine and the temple into the theater of reputation. Elite families did not simply remember ancestors because memory was beautiful. They used ancestry as a form of political capital. A famous name could open doors before a speech was made. A heroic lineage could make ambition appear less like hunger and more like inheritance. In a republic suspicious of kings, divine ancestry offered a delicate advantage. It allowed a man to look exceptional without openly saying he should rule. That balance mattered. Rome had expelled its kings, or at least told the story of their expulsion as the beginning of liberty. To appear too eager for monarchy was dangerous. But to be linked to the gods was not the same as wearing a crown. It was more subtle. It could be shown on coins, implied in funeral speeches, carved into public monuments, whispered through family tradition, and wrapped in the language of piety. The divine did not replace politics. It perfumed it. Venus became one of the most powerful figures in this symbolic language. To modern ears, Venus often sounds like a goddess of beauty and desire, softened by paintings and garden statues. But in Rome, Venus could also carry ancestry, victory, fertility, and public legitimacy. Through the Trojan story, she was the mother of Aeneas, and through Aeneas's son Ascanius, also called Iulus in Roman tradition, certain Roman families could claim a link to the sacred survivors of Troy. The Julian family, the gens Julia, made that claim central. For Julius Caesar, descent from Venus was not a decorative myth kept in the attic of family pride. It was a political weapon polished carefully. At the funeral of his Aunt Julia, Caesar famously emphasized his family's double prestige: royal descent through the line of kings and divine descent through Venus. The claim did not need to be proven in the modern genealogical sense to be effective. Rome was not asking for a laboratory report. It was listening for resonance. And the resonance was strong. Caesar lived in a world where image mattered intensely. Public office, military command, generosity, ancestry, spectacle, and religious position all worked together. He did not invent the use of myth in politics, but he understood its scale. When he dedicated a temple to Venus Genetrix, Venus the Mother, in his new forum, the gesture was not only devotional, it placed his family's divine origin at the center of a public architectural space. Anyone walking there encountered a version of Roman history in which Caesar's bloodline was not merely noble, but sacred. This is not crude propaganda in the simplest sense. It is more interesting than that. Caesar's claim worked because it touched beliefs and traditions already present in Roman culture. The household had long linked family continuity with sacred obligation. The state had long connected public success with divine favor. The Trojan myth had already given Rome a heroic and divine ancestry. Caesar did not have to build the machinery from nothing. He only had to step into it and make it point toward himself. That is often how myth serves power. It does not usually arrive as a lie shouted into silence. It works best when it rearranges things people partly believe already. It takes familiar symbols and tilts them. It makes private ambition feel like public memory. It makes one man's rise seem like the unfolding of an older design. Mars served a different but equally potent purpose. As the father of Romulus and Remus, Mars belonged to the foundation of Rome itself. He was not merely a god of battle in the Greek sense of bloodlust and combat frenzy. In Roman imagination, Mars was tied to protection, masculine force, agriculture in older layers, military discipline, and the city's origin. To invoke Mars was to touch the nerve of Roman identity, the belief that Rome had been born from war, but also that war could be made orderly, sacred, and civic. For political leaders, Mars offered a language of force with legitimacy attached. A commander who won battles could be praised as brave. But if his victories were framed beneath Mars, they became part of Rome's sacred pattern. War was not only violence, it was the defense and expansion of a divinely watched community. That idea could inspire sacrifice and discipline. It could also make conquest easier to justify. When a city believes war is woven into its origin, it may begin to treat expansion as a form of self-expression. Hercules added another kind of symbolic power. He was not Roman in origin, but he became deeply useful in Roman moral imagination. Hercules represented labor, endurance, strength under trial, and the overcoming of monstrous disorder. For ambitious men, association with Hercules could suggest more than brute force. It could imply that greatness required struggle, that extraordinary effort placed a person beyond ordinary measure. The hero who suffers, labors, and conquers can become a mirror in which rulers like to see themselves. But mirrors flatter. That is the danger. Divine ancestry and heroic association do not merely decorate authority. They can numb the audience to its risks. A politician linked to Venus may seem favored by destiny. A general wrapped in Mars may seem like Rome's own violence made flesh. A ruler compared with Hercules may look less like a man seeking domination and more like a burdened savior doing necessary work. Myth can make power feel inevitable. The late Republic was especially vulnerable to this. Its institutions were old, admired, and increasingly strained. Competition among elites had become ferocious. Military commands grew larger. Wealth from conquest distorted politics. Soldiers often felt intense loyalty to successful generals. Public spectacle became more extravagant. In such a world, old Republican language still mattered, but it was no longer always strong enough to contain personal greatness. Myth helped bridge the gap. A man could claim to restore the Republic while surrounding himself with symbols that made him appear larger than Republican equality. He could speak of tradition while quietly using tradition to rise above his rivals. He could honor the gods while making divine honor reflect back onto his own name. This pattern did not end with Caesar. It became even more refined under Augustus. Augustus inherited not only Caesar's name and political network, but also the mythic power attached to the Julian line. As Caesar's adopted heir, he could present himself as the son of the deified Caesar after Caesar's posthumous divinization, and as a descendant of Venus through the family myth. He also drew on Mars through the memory of Romulus and through the language of vengeance, victory, and restored order. Later, Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger, would become central to Augustan symbolism after the civil wars, giving sacred form to the claim that vengeance had been transformed into justice. That transformation was the great Augustan trick. Civil war had torn Rome apart. Romans had killed Romans on a scale that made the old story of Romulus and Remus feel less like distant legend and more like prophecy. Augustus had to make victory over fellow citizens appear not merely successful, but necessary, purified, and divinely approved. Myth gave him the tools. Venus gave ancestry. Mars gave force. Aeneas gave duty. Caesar's divinity gave inheritance. The language of restoration gave comfort. And Rome, exhausted, listened. This does not mean everyone believed every claim in the same way. Roman audiences were sophisticated. They understood performance, rivalry, and political messaging, but symbols do not require universal innocence to work. A coin still circulates whether or not every hand that touches it believes the image. A temple still shapes public memory whether or not every passerby accepts the story completely. Repetition turns interpretation into atmosphere. By the end of the Republic, mythology had become one of Rome's most elegant weapons, not because it forced belief, but because it made power legible. It told people how to look at a name, a victory, a building, a funeral, a coin, a bloodline. It made ambition appear ancestral, It made domination appear protective. It made one family's rise seem connected to Troy, the gods, and the founding wound of the city itself. The old household shrine had taught Rome that the living shared space with the dead. Now Rome's leaders learned how to make the dead campaign for them. Chapter 13. Augustus and the Rewriting of Destiny. After the wars were over, Rome had to learn how to remember them. That was not easy. The city had survived generations of rivalry, assassination, emergency powers, broken alliances, confiscations, prescriptions, and battles in which Roman soldiers killed other Roman soldiers under Roman commanders carrying Roman goals. The Republic had not fallen in one clean, dramatic moment. It had been exhausted, argued over, wounded, and gradually made unable to return to the shape it claimed to love. Then Augustus stood in the ruins and offered Rome a story. Not a simple story, not merely a boast. Something far more durable. A vision in which suffering could be arranged into destiny, violence could be renamed as restoration, and one man's victory could appear as the long-awaited repair of history. Augustus understood something that brutal men often miss. Power does not endure by force alone. It needs memory to cooperate. People must be taught how to speak about what has happened, which wounds should remain visible, which should be covered, and which should be transformed into sacred proof that the present order was necessary. This is where Roman mythology became imperial memory. The Augustan age did not invent Rome's myths, but it edited them with extraordinary care. The old pieces were already there. Aeneas carrying Troy into the future, Venus as divine ancestor, Mars as founder and avenger, Romulus as city maker, Jupiter as guardian of public destiny, the ancestral dead pressing on the living. Augustus gathered these fragments and arranged them into a political cosmos. He did not need to say, crudely, "I am destiny." He could build a world in which destiny kept pointing toward him. Virgil's Aeneid stands at the center of this transformation. It is not a simple piece of praise, and that is why it is so powerful. If it were only flattery, it would have died with the court that encouraged it. Instead, it gives Rome one of its most haunting self-portraits. Glorious, burdened, chosen, and stained. Aeneas moves through the poem as a man pressed forward by duty. He is not allowed to belong entirely to himself. Behind him lies Troy, burning and irrecoverable. Ahead of him lies Italy, war, marriage, settlement, and a future that will not fully reveal itself until long after his own pain has become useful to others. In his journey, Augustus's Rome could see its preferred reflection. The empire was not an accident. It was not merely the result of ambition, armies, and political survival. It was the delayed fulfillment of a sacred mission. That is the official comfort. But Virgil's poem does not let comfort remain pure. The cost is everywhere. Dido is abandoned. Turnus is defeated and killed. Families grieve. The promised future rises through human loss. The poem can celebrate Rome while making celebration feel morally heavy. That tension may be the most honest thing in it. Augustus wanted order after chaos, and Virgil gave him an epic of order, but one in which order is never innocent. This is the detail that keeps the Aeneid alive. It does not erase the darkness beneath Roman destiny. It teaches Rome how to live with it. Augustus's larger cultural program worked in a similar way. Temples were restored. Old rituals were revived or emphasized. Moral legislation tried to present private life as a matter of public health. The past was not treated as a dead archive. It became a tool for rebuilding discipline. Augustus did not present himself as a revolutionary, though his position was revolutionary in practice. He presented himself as the restorer of what Rome had always meant to be. This was political genius. Romans feared kings, so Augustus avoided the blunt language of monarchy. Romans revered tradition, so he dressed unprecedented power in ancestral clothing. Romans believed the gods guarded the city when properly honored, so he surrounded his rule with restoration, piety, divine ancestry, and sacred approval. The result was not a lie in the simple sense. Augustus really did restore temples. He really did bring a kind of stability after civil war. Rome really had been desperate for order, but the interpretation of that order was carefully shaped. The question was not only what Augustus did, it was how Rome was taught to remember why it had needed him. Ovid complicates the picture. Where Virgil gives us destiny with gravity, Ovid gives us mythology with movement, wit, danger, and transformation. His Metamorphoses gathers a vast world of myths into a poem where bodies change, gods desire, humans suffer, and identity refuses to remain fixed. It is dazzling, playful, cruel, elegant, and often uneasy. In an age that wanted moral clarity and restored order, Ovid's mythological imagination could feel slippery. That slipperiness matters. Augustan culture was not a single obedient choir. It contained praise, anxiety, beauty, resistance, ambiguity, and private intelligence. Ovid could participate in the mythic richness of the age while making the gods look impulsive, erotic, comic, and disturbing. His mythology does not always stabilize power. Sometimes it exposes how unstable divine stories can be when looked at too closely. This is the difference between myth as monument and myth as mirror. Augustus preferred monuments. Ovid kept handing Rome mirrors. Eventually, Ovid was exiled by Augustus for reasons still debated, famously referring to a poem and an error. We should not pretend to know more than the evidence allows. The exact political and personal circumstances remain uncertain. But the exile itself has become part of the Augustan story because it reminds us that cultural brilliance lived under power's supervision. A ruler who rewrites destiny may still be anxious about unruly words. The Augustan age, then, was not simply a golden age of poetry floating above politics. It was a moment when art, religion, memory, and authority became intensely entangled. Myth did not merely decorate the new regime. It helped explain why the regime existed. Aeneas gave Augustus a sacred ancestor of duty. Venus gave him divine blood. Mars gave him vengeance converted into order. Jupiter gave his settlement a cosmic ceiling. Romulus gave him the dangerous aura of refounding the city. Even the restored temples became arguments in stone. The gods had returned to their proper places, and Rome had returned to itself. But return can be a very clever disguise for invention. Augustus did not bring back the old republic. He created something new that claimed to preserve the old. That is not a small distinction. It is the heart of the Augustan myth. The past was not revived exactly as it had been. It was selected, polished, rearranged, and made to bless the present. And the Romans were not fools. Many must have understood at least part of the performance. Yet after civil war, performance can become relief. A believable story of order may be preferable to an honest memory of chaos. People do not only accept myths because they are deceived. Sometimes they accept them because they are tired. Augustus offered Rome rest, and then taught that rest to speak in the language of fate. This is why his age marks such a turning point in Roman mythology. The gods were no longer only powers beneath the household roof, guardians of boundaries, omens in the sky, or divine ancestors claimed by ambitious families. They became editors of history. Their stories helped turn a violent political transformation into a sacred historical fulfillment. Rome's past had always been uneasy. Under Augustus, it became arranged. The wolf, the river, Troy, Venus, Mars, Caesar, civil war, restored temples, and the promise of peace were woven into one enormous fabric. Look from far enough away, and the blood became pattern. Look closer, and the stains were still there. That was the secret strength of Augustan myth. It did not make Rome innocent. It made Rome's guilt feel destined. Chapter 14. When emperors became gods. There is a dangerous moment in any empire when honor begins to change shape. At first, a ruler is thanked, then praised, then remembered, then surrounded by ceremonies that make his absence feel almost present. His image appears in public places. His name enters oaths, festivals, coins, prayers, and official language. People learn the gestures expected before his statue. They learn which words sound loyal and which words sound careless. Eventually, the question becomes difficult to avoid. Where does political reverence end and worship begin? Rome did not answer that question all at once. The imperial cult grew through precedent, negotiation, local enthusiasm, official caution, and political necessity. It was not simply one emperor declaring himself a god, while everyone bowed in identical obedience. The reality was more layered. Some emperors received divine honors after death through apotheosis. Some accepted extraordinary honors while alive, especially in the provinces. Some pushed too far and made Romans uneasy. Some allowed the language of divinity to gather around them, without stating every implication too directly. That ambiguity was useful. Augustus was careful with it. After Julius Caesar's assassination, Caesar was officially deified, becoming Divus Julius, the divine Julius. Augustus, as Caesar's adopted son, could then style himself son of a god without claiming, in the bluntest Roman terms, to be a living god in the city of Rome. This distinction mattered. Rome still carried old republican nerves. It could honor divinity connected to a ruler while pretending not to kneel before monarchy. It could say, "This is not kingship. This is sacred memory, gratitude, and cosmic order." But the line was thin. In the provinces, especially in the Greek-speaking East where ruler cult had older traditions, divine honors for living rulers were easier to express. Cities built temples, established priesthoods, and honored emperors as symbols of Roman peace and power. This was piety, diplomacy, loyalty, and survival woven together. To honor the emperor's divine presence was to honor the system that controlled roads, armies, courts, taxes, security, and danger. Refusing such honor could look less like private disbelief and more like public disobedience. That is one of the unsettling features of the imperial cult. It did not require every participant to hold the same inner belief. Ancient ritual often cared more about public action than private psychology. A sacrifice, an oath, an offering of incense, a festival in the emperor's name. These acts created visible loyalty, Whether the person performing them felt awe, fear, gratitude, habit, or calculation was not always the central concern. The empire needed bodies to move correctly in public. The gods had always been part of Roman order. Now the emperor entered that sacred machinery. Apotheosis gave the process a formal grandeur. After an emperor died, the Senate could vote divine honors, placing him among the divi, the deified ones. The ceremony and symbolism suggested that the ruler's human life had been transformed into a sacred presence. In some accounts, an eagle released from the funeral pyre carried the soul upward, a theatrical gesture that made ascent visible to the crowd. Whether every Roman believed the emperor had literally risen into the heavens is not the only question. The ritual taught the empire how to remember power after death. A dead emperor could become a god. A living emperor could become the son, successor, priest, and beneficiary of that god. This gave imperial rule a chain of sacred inheritance. The new ruler did not stand alone. He stood beneath divine predecessors, inside a family of power that reached beyond the grave. The old household logic returned in monstrous scale. Just as a Roman family honored its ancestors and used memory to sustain identity, the empire honored imperial ancestors and used divinity to sustain rule. The palace became a public family shrine, and the people were expected to understand their place before it. There is something brilliant in that. There is also something frightening. When power becomes sacred, criticism changes. To oppose a bad policy is one thing. To offend a divine ruler, his genius, his numen, his image, or his cult is another. The emperor's body may remain human, hungry, ill, vain, cruel, frightened, mortal, but the office around him grows luminous. That glow can protect stability, but it can also conceal rot. A weak man may be dressed in cosmic language. A violent man may be praised as a guardian of peace. A paranoid man may receive incense. The imperial cult reveals Rome's old talent for turning anxiety into ritual. The empire was enormous. Its peoples spoke many languages, worshipped many gods, and carried many local memories. How could such a world be held together? Law and army mattered, of course, but symbols traveled where legions could not stand every hour. The emperor's image, stamped on coins and raised in cities, offered a shared point of recognition. His cult created a religious political grammar that different communities could use to express belonging. In that sense, worship of the emperor was not only flattery from below or vanity from above. It was infrastructure. A temple to the emperor could bind a city to Rome. A festival could let local elites perform loyalty. A priesthood of the imperial cult could give ambitious provincials a role inside imperial order. A statue could make distant power visible in the marketplace. The emperor might never visit, but his image already had. This is the strange genius of empire. Absence made present through ritual. But the system depended on performance, and performance could become excessive. Some emperors tested Roman tolerance by leaning too heavily into divinity while alive. Caligula, Nero, Domitian, Commodus, and others became associated in different ways with divine self-presentation, theatrical grandeur, or claims that later writers treated with hostility. We must be cautious, because many accounts of bad emperors come from senatorial or later sources with their own agendas. Roman elite writers often used religious arrogance as evidence that a ruler had become tyrannical. Still, the pattern is revealing. To act too much like a god while alive was a sign that an emperor had forgotten the useful mask of restraint. Rome could accept sacred power. It disliked being reminded too openly that power wanted worship. The best imperial divinity was often indirect. The emperor restored temples. He honored the gods. He descended from divine ancestors. His genius was worshipped. His dead predecessor was deified. His rule brought peace, prosperity, victory, or at least the official language of those things. He stood at the center of a sacred system without always saying plainly, "I am a god." Bluntness was dangerous. Elegance worked better. This is why the imperial cult should not be dismissed as absurd flattery. It was one of the ways Rome solved the problem of monarchy after centuries of claiming to hate kings. The emperor could be more than a magistrate and less than a king in old republican language, more than a man and not always quite a god in traditional language. He occupied a carefully unstable category. That instability allowed Rome to keep contradictions alive. Republican memories, monarchical reality, divine honors, civic ritual, personal loyalty, and state control. The emperor became the place where those contradictions met. And once that happened, Roman mythology changed again. The gods were no longer only ancient figures from household, hill, field, and epic. Myth was no longer only about origins. It became contemporary. It had a face on the coin in your hand. It had a temple in your province. It had a birthday festival. It had an official portrait. It could die, be judged, and ascend. Power itself had entered the mythological system, yet every apotheosis contained an uncomfortable reminder. An emperor became divine because he had died. The mortal body had to disappear before the sacred image could fully harden. The ceremony that raised him toward heaven also confirmed that even the ruler of the known world could not keep breath in his lungs. That may be the hidden irony of emperor worship. It promised that power could become eternal, but it needed a corpse to prove it. Rome had begun with gods in thresholds, fires, rivers, fields, and ancestral shadows. Now it found divinity in the ruler's image, in imperial succession, in the performance of loyalty across provinces. The sacred had not vanished from daily life. It had climbed into administration, into propaganda, into the theater of monarchy, and the empire learned to bow before its own reflection. Chapter 15. The Old Gods in a Changing Empire. By the later centuries of the Roman Empire, the sacred world had become crowded in a different way. Not simply crowded with gods. Rome had always known how to live with many gods. The old city had begun among household spirits, boundary powers, ancestral dead, sacred fires, omens, vows, and careful negotiations with forces no one could see. Crowded was normal. What changed was the atmosphere. The empire had become vast, multilingual, restless, and increasingly difficult to hold together. Soldiers moved along frontiers. Merchants carried objects and stories across seas. Philosophers reinterpreted ancient gods as symbols of cosmic principles. Mystery cults offered initiation and belonging. Local deities persisted beneath Roman names. Emperors reached for divine language. Solar worship rose in prominence. And Christianity, once one cult among many in Roman eyes, grew into a force that would eventually challenge the old sacred order at its roots. The old gods did not disappear in a sudden night. They became layered. A Roman in this changing world might still honor Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Vesta, or the ancestral spirits, but those gods no longer stood in the same landscape they had occupied in the early Republic. They shared space with Isis, Mithras, the Great Mother, local gods of Gaul, Syria, North Africa, Britain, and the Balkans, philosophical abstractions, imperial divinity, and increasingly powerful forms of monotheistic devotion. The empire had become a map of overlapping heavens. This is where the word syncretism becomes useful, though it can sound too tidy. Syncretism means the blending or identification of different religious traditions, but in real life it was rarely smooth. A local god might be identified with Mercury, Mars, Apollo, or Jupiter because the Roman name offered a bridge. A goddess from one region could be honored through the image of another. A divine title could travel and attach itself to new forms. Sometimes this blending helped people speak across cultures. Sometimes it flattened differences. Sometimes it created something genuinely new. Rome had always translated gods. In the late Empire, translation became almost a condition of life. But translation also raises a question. When a god changes names, images, and meanings, is it the same god? Ancient worshippers did not answer that question in one way. Some probably cared deeply about local specificity. Others accepted layered identities with ease. A soldier from one province might worship a god under a Roman title while carrying memories of a very different homeland. A city might honor an imperial deity publicly while families maintained older practices privately. Philosophers might insist that the many gods were expressions of one divine order, while ordinary worshippers continued to ask particular gods for healing, protection, childbirth, victory, or safe travel. This made late Roman religion both rich and anxious. Rich, because it allowed enormous imaginative variety. An empire of many peoples could produce a religion of many doors. A person could move from public ceremony to private devotion, from civic festival to initiation, from ancestral custom to philosophical speculation. The sacred world offered choices, intensities, and affiliations that older civic religion alone may not have supplied. Anxious, because too many doors can make a house feel unstable. The traditional Roman system had depended on shared public acts. It did not demand that everyone tell the same inner story about the gods, but it did expect participation in the visible rituals that bound community and state. As new religious movements emphasized personal salvation, initiation, exclusive loyalty, or a deeper inward relationship with the divine, the old civic framework began to feel less complete. Mystery cults had already pointed in this direction. They did not necessarily reject public religion, but they offered something more intimate than the old state ceremonies. Initiation mattered. Sacred knowledge mattered. The worshipper did not merely stand in a crowd while officials performed the ritual. He or she entered a smaller circle, crossed a boundary, and belonged in a more personal way. Christianity sharpened the challenge. Unlike many cults that could coexist within the Roman religious marketplace, Christianity increasingly insisted on exclusive devotion to one God. That exclusivity was the real disruption. Rome could absorb foreign gods because foreign gods usually could be added. A new goddess, a new mystery, a new healing power, a new solar title. These could be placed beside the old, regulated, interpreted, and folded into imperial life. But a religion that rejected the gods as false, refused sacrifice to them, and treated worship of the emperor or traditional deities as unacceptable could not be absorbed so easily. It threatened the method by which Rome had survived. This does not mean the conflict was simple from the beginning, or that every Christian and every pagan stood in fixed opposition. Reality was messier. People lived in families, cities, armies, and social networks where beliefs overlapped and changed unevenly. Some Christians used Roman cultural forms. Some pagan thinkers moved toward ideas of supreme divine unity. Some aristocrats held to traditional cults as part of memory, identity, and education. Some emperors persecuted Christians. Later emperors supported them. The balance shifted over time. What matters for this story is the pressure. The old gods found themselves interpreted in new ways. Philosophers, especially in traditions influenced by Platonism, could read the gods less as quarrelsome personalities and more as symbols, powers, intermediaries, or expressions of a higher cosmic order. This was not disbelief. It was reinterpretation. Myth became allegory. Ritual became assent. The old stories, embarrassing if taken too literally, could be rescued by being made deeper. That rescue was also a sign of danger. A myth that must be defended as allegory has entered a different kind of argument. The old confidence of public ritual. We do this because our ancestors did this, because the gods require it, because the city is protected by it, now had to compete with philosophical criticism and Christian attack. Pagan intellectuals did not simply abandon the gods. Many refined them. They made them more metaphysical, more universal, more compatible with a cosmos governed by hierarchy and mind. The gods became more sophisticated. They also became less immediate. Solar worship offers another revealing layer. The sun, visible to all, ruler of the day, giver of light, became an attractive symbol in an empire searching for unity. Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, carried imperial power, cosmic order, and military confidence in one radiant image. A solar god could speak across local boundaries more easily than a deeply provincial deity. Light made a good imperial language. It promised centrality, victory, and universality. Yet even this did not erase the older gods. Late Roman religion was not a clean replacement of many gods by one sun, then one god. It was a long period of overlap. Old cults continued, local devotions persisted, imperial policy shifted. Temples remained standing in some places, while churches rose in others. Sacred habits outlived official favor. People do not stop feeling the holiness of a place simply because a decree changes the status of its gods. That is why the decline of official pagan worship should not be imagined as a curtain falling after the final act. It was more like a city changing its language street by street. Some words vanished from public use. Others survived as poetry. Some rituals were condemned. Others were transformed, reinterpreted, or quietly remembered. Statues became art objects, warnings, trophies, or relics of a defeated order. Temples were closed, reused, neglected, destroyed, or converted depending on place and circumstance. The gods lost their official political future, but not their imaginative life. And in the final centuries of pagan Rome, there must have been people who felt the old world thinning. Not gone, not yet, but less secure. The gods who had once guarded the household, the field, the boundary, the senate, the army, and the emperor now faced a rival sacred story with sharper claims. Rome's old religion had been generous because it could add. Christianity grew powerful by refusing addition. It offered not another divine guest behind Roman gates, but a different understanding of truth itself. That was the deepest break. Rome could tolerate a stranger god. It struggled with a god who made the others impossible. And so the old mythology entered its twilight not as a dead system, but as a contested inheritance. It had become poetry, philosophy, civic memory, local habit, aristocratic identity, imperial symbolism, and, to its opponents, error. It was more layered than ever, but layering could not save it from the fact that the rules of the sacred conversation were changing. The old gods had survived conquest, translation, foreign rivals, political use, and imperial transformation. Now they faced something different, not another god to absorb, a new world in which absorption itself was no longer enough. Chapter 16. The Gods After the Fall. The old gods did not vanish when their temples lost power. They lost sacrifices. They lost official protection. They lost the public confidence of a world that had once asked Jupiter for victory, Vesta for continuity, Mars for force, Venus for ancestry, and the dead for family memory. But disappearance is not the same as defeat. A god can leave the altar and survive in language, art, fear, poetry, and the habits of imagination. That is what happened to Rome's mythology. As official pagan worship declined, the gods became safer in another form. They could be read instead of worshipped, painted instead of invoked, studied instead of sacrificed to. A figure that might once have received offerings could become a symbol in a manuscript, a moral example, an allegory, a planet, a statue in a garden, a name for desire, war, wisdom, fortune, or empire. Christian writers did not simply ignore the old gods. Many attacked them, mocked them, reinterpreted them, or used them as evidence of the errors of the pagan past. Yet even criticism preserved them. To argue against Venus, Mars, Jupiter, or Saturn, one still had to name them. The gods survived inside the very books that tried to bury them. Later in the Renaissance, they returned with new elegance, not as living public deities in the Roman sense, but as images of beauty, power, intellect, and cosmic order. Artists painted Venus rising from the sea, Mars disarmed by love, Mercury in motion, Saturn as time, Diana as chastity and wilderness. Humanists read ancient texts with hunger. Patrons filled palaces with mythological scenes, not because Rome's old religion had returned unchanged, but because its symbols could speak again. This was not resurrection. It was transformation. The gods had become a cultural language. They gave Europe a way to think about the body, power, virtue, passion, violence, and fate without speaking only in biblical terms. Myth allowed artists and writers to explore dangerous human subjects under ancient masks. Desire could be Venus, rage could be Mars, rule could be Jupiter, time could be Saturn, wisdom could wear Minerva's helmet. Even the sky kept their names. Planets moved through the night, carrying Roman divinity into astronomy. The days of the week, in several languages, preserved old sacred associations through Roman and Germanic translations. Political powers borrowed eagles, fasces, triumphal arches, republican language, imperial imagery, and the cold grandeur of Rome's symbolic inheritance. Modern states that would never sacrifice to Jupiter still learned how useful Roman symbols could be. That is the final irony. Rome's gods survived because they stopped needing belief in the old form. They became flexible enough to inhabit museums, poems, operas, novels, films, architecture, brand names, legal language, military symbols, and the private imagination of anyone who has ever described love as venereal, war as martial, or a sudden lucky turn as fortune. Their temples could crumble, but their vocabulary remained. And perhaps this reveals the deepest secret of Roman mythology. It was never only about gods. It was about how human beings give shape to forces they cannot escape. Birth, hunger, death, sex, family, violence, memory, law, empire, time. Rome named those forces, housed them, negotiated with them, weaponized them, feared them, and finally handed them to the future. The sacred fire went out, but the smoke entered the language of the world. The gods did not disappear. They changed masks,